What is up, everyone? Welcome to the Zero Detraction Podcast, the podcast all about how first-time founders create companies that scale. I'm one of your regular co-hosts, JDM, aka Josh David Miller, and I facilitate the launch and scale of startups and other innovations. And I am here with my friend, my co-host, and the executive director of the Carlson Center at Sac State, Cameron Law. Cameron, how are you?
I'm doing good. Good to be back in action. We're 2 for 2 here coming back. So we're excited to dive in today, but I'm looking forward to empowering entrepreneurs with some insights and hopefully some questions for them to ponder.
Yeah, two weeks in a row. I don't know how many in a row before we get a set of steak knives, but we're just, just racking them up so that we can get there. Well, we've got I think a pretty fun topic today that just kind of builds on last week's show about cycles in the process of startups. We're going to talk about pitch deck today, but we're not going to be talking about how to make your pitch deck better. We're going to be talking about why you probably shouldn't be focusing on your pitch deck at all. So we're calling this the Your Pitch Deck is Not Your Business edition of the Zero Detraction Podcast. And like 30,000 foot view, Cameron, like get us started here. Why are we talking about pitch decks today if we're not talking about how to make it better?
I love it. Well, thanks for teeing up for the question here to get us started. And I think oftentimes when we think of pitch decks, we're putting ourselves in that presentation mode, right? Of like telling the story. But if we don't get the right evidence and information to tell that story, we're ultimately just telling this continued fable, right? And so I think one of the things that we really want to focus on and what we're going to dive into in terms of our conversation here is that your pitch deck is a tool, but it's a tool that isn't just to continue to sharpen your saw, for lack of a better term. It's really diving into understanding what risks are you identifying in this when you're presenting your business, right? It's about the feedback that you're taking, and then how does your business have to change, not your pitch deck? We want to kind of separate the two in that ultimately the pitch deck is a tool that talks about your business, but it's not your core focus of just refining and refining this tool. It's about actually what goes into it and what work have you done to ultimately validate that concept. And that's where, we'll connect back to the cycles from last week. But would love to pass it back to you as we think of kind of this concept of, cycles and the evidence that goes into our pitch deck. How might we decouple this kind of concept of like, I'm in the business of building a pitch deck, maybe as I'm fundraising, is actually about I need to identify the evidence and the information and traction that should go into it.
Yeah, I think something you said just kind of really resonated with me, that the idea that the pitch deck is a tool. And that embedded in that is the idea that you have a business and you're creating a pitch on your business, right? Thus, the pitch deck is not your business edition. But what that mistake that a lot of founders make is conflating the two. And they seem to think that the process is somehow, I'm going to create a sexy pitch, and that's the business that I'm in. And the better pitch that I can create, the more polished, the more impressive the pitch is, and the more impressive the business is. And nothing could be further from the truth. Because at the end of the day, you're probably only fooling yourself anyway, and a couple of lazy ass investors, and you probably don't want them in anywhere near your company anyway. So instead, like what we're trying to do is create a really strong business. And then once you have a really strong business, the pitch is easy because all you're doing is telling a story of this awesome shit that you did, instead of, trying to create this impressive story that comes out of nowhere. And I blame a lot for this. Like I blame Shark Tank, I think is a big, cause of our, like just this perception, the cultural zeitgeist, that our goal is to like put on our sales hat and go in there and rock it and crush it and give this stellar sales pitch, and then people are gonna be like, yeah, I'm in 10% for this. And that's just not the way the world works. And we can get into some of that later, but to kind of round it back, if a pitch is a story of your business, then what you're trying to do is create a good business. And one of the reframes that I like is, a lot of people will think about, well, our startup is a business that solves a problem for a customer. But if you are actually intending to raise venture capital, if you're actually trying to do substantive investment, your customers aren't your customers, and your product isn't your product. Your customers are the investors, and the product is your business. And so you can don this, really sexy deck, but at the end of the day, what you're really doing is what a used car salesman does, and not the good kind, the sleazy cultural stereotype of a used car salesman, with the gold necklace and everything, and that they're just trying to sell you on something. And we all know we're just being sold to, and that the car is really a piece of shit lemon. And everybody sees through it. And as easily as we see through them, they're going to see through you. And so instead of that, what we want to do is tell the story of our businesses, do the real work of the business to create a valuable business. And then our pitch is just telling our customers, the investors, why this is a valuable business, why it's a good business to be in, why now, why is the market right for this, that we could scale with this thing. Why can we make money at this? Answering all those why questions. So they're like, this makes sense. This has the potential to 10x, 100x, and I want to throw some of my cash, down on this particular idea. That's what we're trying to do. And so the pitch deck is the final piece, and it's not the piece that you start with. And that's the mistake most founders make. And so, like this idea of cycles that we talked about last time. I didn't forget your question, Cameron. It just seemed that way. This idea of cycle.
We're getting there.
Yeah, I got there eventually, and just in time to pass it back to you, so that this isn't a monologue, but or any longer a monologue. Is like I said, the cycles don't directly appear in the deck, but something you called out, about your riskiest assumptions, which is what the cycles are doing, right? The cycles, and if you want an overview of the cycles, you can listen to last week's episode, but. The idea of cycles is just cyclically identifying and reducing risk. Like that's what we're doing. And the pitch deck is telling a story at any one single point in time. And so when we think about the kinds of things that the cycles, this build, measure, learn loop that the work of the startup of this de-risking process delivers, where are we going to, because you don't have a slide on that in your deck. So like Cameron, where do we see those concepts show up in a pitch deck?
I love it. Well, I wanted to go back to one quick thing, and then I'll get to that question. And I just wanted to put a pin in.
We don't need to ever answer each other's questions. As long as we're interesting, nobody's going to care.
I swear I won't take 5 minutes like you did to get to the next point of conversation.
I reserve the right to filibuster.
But I'm reminded of this quote in relation to thinking of your business model as the solution. It comes from Ash Maurya, the founder of kind of the lean stack, and then also kind of the lean canvas, but was your business model is your solution, not your product. And so it's this mindset of if you're taking on venture capital, it's about how do you actually gain evidence around these riskiest components of your model succeeding, because that's ultimately what you're, quote unquote, selling in your investment process. And so you need to gain validation that there's there in order to ultimately bring on that investment. And so we often kind of tee up that conversation of your business model is your solution, not your product, if you're going through that lens of ultimately raising capital. And so
I love that quote. That's a great quote from Ash.
Yeah. And so, as we look at how do you integrate, your learnings and the evidence and those cycles into your pitch deck, part of that is, the evolution of the deck as a tool, right? When you're first starting out, it's a way to kind of represent what is your idea in its totality. But as you ultimately gain evidence from the market, you're building those connections from who your customer is, and you're bringing in that persona. And I know JDM always loves that I have the, data deb or those types of things, but it really, that evidence that you've gained to validate that persona or your core customer is that, right? And you can gain that evidence by saying, I ran this set of tests, whether that's a landing page test, or I went and did 50 customer interviews, and that narrowed down to that X% of these people, showed the whites of their eyes that this was a pain point that they ultimately had, right? And so you're gaining this information that now tells that story in a more impactful way than just being kind of this fable that you're ultimately coming up with. And so the key component is, as you do these cycles, the scaffolding of the evidence is really key, because if you built it up, we often say is you build a house of cards. And so if you don't have the evidence of who your customers and their pain point and the need in the market, well, all of the other evidence that you might have is based on those risky assumptions. And that's ultimately what an investor is going to be identifying and ultimately asking questions around. And I think, with that concept of engagement with investors with this tool, I'd love to turn it back to you just from past conversations we've had around when investors or individuals, it could be advisors, are asking questions. Oftentimes, how do founders maybe take that in the right or the wrong way in relation to the use of the pitch deck, right? Is it to go, build that next iteration of the deck to answer the question, or is it about to build the business and go identify that evidence? And I'd love for you to dive into that.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I like it because it frames it in a continuing theme of cycles, right? So like as you go and give your pitch, the questions and feedback that you get from investors allow you, that's data, right? That you get back, and then you can form another experiment, do another iteration of your deck, and go through the process again. So again, it cycles all the way down, baby. So I like using the Q&A as a kind of a framing device for that. So I think there's when you get a question from an investor, and I've been in the shoes of listening to pitches thousands of times and asking questions, and there's like just a few categories of questions that you get, and the first one, the one that's kind of easiest to take care of, is the questions that are, what did you mean by, or if somebody says, what's your business model, or something like that, what they're highlighting is a lack of clarity, either because it was missing or because you told the story poorly. And so your goal, like your principal goal just from the act of pitching, is to get as few of those questions as possible, right? You want, tell me more about, or are you familiar, with this other thing, or, how are you going to, scale to the blah, 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 or what's your customer acquisition cost? Or those kinds of questions are getting into the detail that you may not have had time for in a 5-minute, 10-minute pitch, 20 maybe. But what they're doing is saying like, okay, like tell me more, right? Like tell me more. And that's great. But if they're just saying like, what do you mean by, or I'm sorry, what does your product do again? And yes, I've asked that question many times in response to a pitch. It's never a good thing. But I've heard all manner of pitches. So if you want to track like how successful are you in pitching, I would actually say it's not about getting to yeses, because you don't get a yes in the conversation anyway. You just get another meeting. Like that's what you're going for, is like getting another meeting. Your actual metric of success in pitching is the ratio of tell me more questions versus what did you mean by questions. And you're going to start with some what do you mean by, because this is something that takes practice. And then as that decreases, you get more of the higher quality questions, which means you're maximizing the time that you have in front of them, and your business generally makes sense. So that's that kind of category of just like, let's make sure our pitch is clear. A second category are the questions where something's completely missing. And it's not missing because you just didn't mention it, like what's your customer acquisition cost? That may not have made it onto the slide, and that's okay. And you may be at a stage where you actually don't know that yet because you're still experimenting and it doesn't make a lot of sense. But talking about something that's just not there. And really commonly, things that aren't included are a really specific customer segment, a go-to-market strategy, use of funds. I actually see omitted, like, give me $1 million and don't worry about how we're going to spend it. All of those questions, right? So if something is just missing, the problem could either be your pitch deck, right? That you just like, oh, shoot, I need a slide for that, or I'm getting that consistently, I better add that to a slide. I'm gonna add the customer acquisition cost to our revenue model slide, or something. And but it could be also because you just haven't done the work yet. And that tells you like, the cycle that I need to do here is not in the pitch. The cycle that I need to do is with the business. I need to go make the product better, the product being the business model. I need to go make the product better so that I can come back with an answer that makes sense here. I need to do the work to plug the hole. The third and final category that I would give, so we have like clarity, and then we have like missing components here. And then the third category is, I'm not sure what a good word, but I'll just call it like disbelief. Skepticism is probably a good word, the skeptical questions. And this could take an obvious form, like, you can really do that, which is not a good question to be asked, by the way, usually. But it could be that kind of thing. But it could just be skepticism in terms of your ability to reach the customers in the way that you think you can for the cost that you think you can on the channels that you're trying to as part of go-to-market. It could be something like that. Or it could be skepticism in the whether something will pencil out as far as your revenue model is concerned. Like, you're not charging enough for that based on your, based on the unit cost. And so clearly you don't understand the unique economics or something like that. These are the questions that can be hardest to tease out where the problem is. And this is where you're going to have to rely on your gut and like set your ego aside, because sometimes it's going to be just the investor's wrong. Like, I'm not going to set up investors on a pedestal and say, just because we listen to pitches all day, we know what we're talking about. Like, that's not a thing. And so instead, you have to like acknowledge some of them are just going to be wrong about that. And that's okay. But that's not going to be most of the time. Most of the time, that skepticism is coming from you're breaking a pattern that exists in their head. And that pattern usually shouldn't be broken. And again, not assuming they're not completely wrong. And then again, there are some edge cases, but aside from those edge cases and aside from the investor being wrong, you're breaking from a pattern that works. And so it's just going to make it harder to raise money anyway. So the question is, why are you breaking from that pattern? And I would say that it's 9 out of 10 times you're breaking that pattern because the underlying work hasn't been done. And there's more, you need to go and do more validation with customers. You have to go figure out, is this the right price? Like, if I were to charge more for that, would this still work? You see this a lot. One, as an example, this will be the last thing I say before I kick it back to you, Cameron. So, wake up and everything. But one of the places that I personally see this a lot is when you have, like, you're talking about your revenue model and you're saying, we're selling it for this price. And, we have evidence because we have some sales right now. And then during Q&A, it comes out that the revenue from sales was at like a massive discount. And you did a massive discount just to get some early sales, not because it was a fraction of a product, but simply because usually the founder lacks the confidence to charge full price, or they're afraid that customers won't pay the full price. And almost always that's actually signaling a lack of value, that there isn't the value in the product. Either you're wrong and there is the value in the product, or there's not and the customer's not going to pay it, in which case your whole revenue model falls apart because you're charging so much less than what fits in your revenue model. And that will always come out during a pitch. And then that'll be expressed in terms of skepticism. And so that just means you have to go do work in terms of validating the business model side.
Love it.
So did I like, there was a lot on it, on that, but basically, like 30,000 foot view, when you get questions from investors, that is the data that you can use to create cycles. And if they're asking you clarity questions, you got work to do on the pitch itself. If they're asking you questions about, about something that's just completely missing, then it's either because you left it out of your pitch or because you don't have it, which one, go do the work, right? Or third, that there's some skepticism that gets surfaced. And most of the time that means that there's work outside of the pitch that you have to do in order to close the gap on the pitch. So
for sure.
How did that land, Cameron? Like, did that make any sense at all?
It made total sense. And I think I go back to, when you get those questions, it's identifying those areas you need to focus on. And oftentimes, I think when we look at founders, sometimes they get defensive in relation to hearing those questions. And it doesn't mean that you have to just make up the answer, right? It's like, that's a really great question. I don't yet have evidence for that, but now I know that that's kind of my marching order going forward in relation to whatever kind of that risk might look like. And part of it, as you look at the deck as a tool, it's really identifying the evidence across those cycles in relation to, and we talked about it, was the desirability, right? That whole front end usually of your pitch is, what evidence do you have about the demand for what you're trying to create? And do you have evidence of clearly who that early adopter is going to be and how you're going to get in front of them on a regular basis, right? And so the investors on the other side are looking for and basically going through that pattern to say, hey, do they have this clear insight? Okay, good. From there, now is it actually viable? What's the monetization strategy behind those elements? And do they have evidence in relation to that? Have they done price testing? Have they understood what the cost to acquire a customer would be? And if they don't, what would their methodology be, right? And so it's not always that you have to have the answers, but it's, what is your way to start to calculate that at some point and understand, as we know, oftentimes those first customers can be much more manual than you hope down the line. But you need to be able to understand that this is kind of what you're working towards. And then that last element is that feasibility. So do you actually have the team, the technology? And that's sometimes where that disbelief might come into fruition. But if you have the team that has that background, or you have some early understanding of how you might be building it, that's where you're demonstrating that particular evidence. And so again, it's one of the ways, just to maybe reframe it, is, yes, you want to have energy and passion for what you're doing, but it's really about how are you sharing this information that you've gained about the business that you've been working on, and gaining that evidence to now articulate that back to then why this is not as risky of a bet for them to ultimately work with you. And there was one component I wanted to go back to in relation to the pitch and the ask. I think use of funds is always a key element, but I think as we tie this concept of cycles and evidence, is what is the milestone that you're going to reach, which is really the next big piece of evidence that you're gathering to why this startup should exist, right? And so it's like, I'm going to use these funds to basically get us to this next point, which is this proof point of why we should continue to exist and invest our time, energy, and money in relation to it.
Oh, 100. Like one of the things I really often talk about is that a pitch is a story. And I don't mean a story of like, meet Sally, or student Sally, or you're better at the persona naming thing. But, meet student Steve, I guess makes sense. Or like, meet student Steve, student Steve is overwhelmed. And then you go problem solution. Like, that is a story, but it's a story within a story, right? It's not, that doesn't, like, Steve doesn't make an appearance on all 10 slides. But the whole 10 slide pitch is also the story of your business. And that last little part is the part where you're asking for money, or whatever the ask is. We're assuming it's fundraising. So assuming that, then you're saying that, like, our next step is to get there, we need from you this money, and we're going to do X, Y, and Z, which will get us to that point, which looks like this, right? And so it's like, it's literally the manifestation of a macro cycle, and you're gonna have a ton of micro cycles in there, but like, it is literal manifestation of that macro cycle. And oftentimes, like, I think founders approach that backward. And I think that's kind of what you were pointing at too, is that they'll be like, well, we need money. Startups often raise 750. So let's raise 750 and we're going to hire this person and we're going to hire that person. And then you ask questions like, what's your runway going to be? Right. And they might know, or they might not. If they don't, like, get out. If they do know, they're going to say something like, oh, that'll get us, 18 months of runway. And then you ask them the follow-up question, which is, and where does that get you? And then you get the crickets, and then it's get the hell out of my office, right? It's like, so like you have to approach it from the other side, which is our next step is that proof point. I love that term you used, Cameron. Like, our next step is a proof point. How to reverse engineer to get to that. I wanted to ask you a follow-up question, if I could, on something you said before.
And then just one quick thing I wanted to, because it made me think of, I wonder what it would look like to create almost like a test card for an investment ask. So like, we believe that, we need, $250,000 of investment. Therefore we will, it'd be interesting to set up something in relation to like, what is that big next milestone that you're ultimately trying to get to with the funding. And so it's like, it is a macro experiment and there's other things in there. But it was like, we believe that this money is going to get us to this next major milestone that ultimately will move us forward. So that was top of my head. That's
interesting.
But just something for us to maybe chew on later. But yeah, hit me with your question.
I always like a fun new project to distract me. So that's a good. I want to think about that. Yeah. So you mentioned really early on in our conversation today about how the startup pitch is a tool, and then when you were talking before about the ask and all that, you mentioned that I don't remember exactly how you said it. But you said something about it not following the template. That it didn't follow the format or template that the investor was expecting to hear that information, and therefore it fell through. And so I'm hearing tool and like template, format, right? So that's starting to get some clarity in here. And my question for you was like, so when you talk about that template, and I apologize if that's not the word you use, I have to look at the transcript later, and then I'll go back in and edit all of this so I sound smart. But when you talk about that template, like what is that template that you're referring to? Is it across the whole deck? Is it on individual slides? Is it both? Like, what's the template?
Yeah, really great question. And I originally kind of think of it in terms of there's as they're looking at hearing your pitch and the deck as the tool that helps articulate that is helping them identify what those riskiest components are, right? They're naturally thinking, if I'm going to invest, what is the greatest risk at the front end? And so they want to like be able to get that information quickly to then say, okay, I'm on to the next thing. And so usually there's, I guess a pattern in relation to the template of a deck. And, usually at that front end, you're talking about that customer demand and the evidence that you've gained in that particular point of things. And so we ultimately dive into, who's your customer, what are their pain points, what value proposition do you have, and what solution ultimately is out there that you've created to solve that particular problem, right? And so I usually see it kind of related to telling through that desirability, viability, and then feasibility elements of it. That's kind of how my brain thinks of it, and particularly when we're looking at it from a testing lens or that kind of cycles, that's the evidence that you're gaining that then ultimately everything builds on from there. So if you get the customer wrong and there's a lot of risk there, likely your go-to-market strategy, which will be after, is going to be wrong as well. And so we want to kind of go through that element and start to systematically tell that story of how we have de-risked our business over that process. And so I think of it kind of from that desirability, viability, feasibility lens of that template. But there's, a ton of, templates out there, Guy Kawasaki's 10 slides. And I think, one of the quotes that we often talk about is the purpose of a pitch is to stimulate interest, not to close the deal. Right. And it's that element of having that conversation. And oftentimes I think what's missed in the whole pitch process is that most of it happens even before you even show someone your pitch deck, right? And so you have to have that clear conversation of like, hey, here's the problem X, here's who has the problem, and here's the solution I'm creating, and here's the evidence that I have that's ultimately backing it up to then say, oh, we would love to have a conversation because it seems like there's interest and demand for it. That then leads to the actual formal pitch. But if you're not able to clearly articulate what your business is all about and who you're targeting, their pain points, and how you're solving that problem, and then ultimately monetizing it going forward, then usually it falls pretty flat. So I don't know if that totally dove into the template concept, but I really think of it in relation to the evidence around those different assumptions that we have, and it starts with who cares about what you're creating.
Yeah, that's perfect, because when we talk about the pitch being a tool to talk about a business, I think that it starts getting us down a path where when we start talking about templates, it takes us kind of the rest of the way to the point where we can turn on its head what the pitch is for and how we engage with it. And so the number of times that I hear founders say, "Oh, I need to revise my pitch deck and keep updated," I'm like, why? You're not fundable. Like, why? Like, if you're engaging in a pitch competition or something like that, of course, like, we put in work for specific events and competitions all the time. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you're just like doing a pitch deck because that's what startups do, then you're actually fundamentally missing the mark about what startups do, which is build valuable businesses. And so if you focus on building the valuable business, and then you can take the tool, Guy Kawasaki's 10 slide template, or any one of 100 other formats out there, and then you can just plug in what you have. And if you get to a slide where you can't just plug in what you have, it's because you don't have it. Right? It's because the problem isn't the pitch deck. And so put the pitch deck down, stop trying to pitch to investors, and go do the work of the business. And let me tell you something else. Yeah, we've entered a rant. But it's a short one. By JDM standards anyway. The rant is that this is a fact. 0.05% of startups raise venture capital. 0.05. That's 1 in 2,000 startups raise venture capital, and that includes several failure points along the way. And it also it includes the companies in the 99 95% that maybe have raised angel, friends, family, fools, or something like that, but they never raised institutional investment. They never got as far as a fund. But so anyway, it's astronomically high. Most businesses are not made or broken by the investment. They're made and broken by what happens within the company itself. Most startups are not killed by the market. Most startups do not starve because of lack of funds. Most startups commit suicide. Here endeth the rant.
Well, share more of why that's the case. Is that because they're doing things that don't matter, or what specifically leads to some of that?
I mean, it's there's a number of things. Everybody says like, oh, team is responsible, and that's all true. But at the end of the day, I think a big part of it is what you just said. What came to mind first for you, which is focusing on the wrong things. Like founders spend so much time focusing on shit that doesn't matter. And the pitch deck is one of those things, which is why, like, I often tell founders, like, you don't need a pitch deck. Like, stop it. But when you're getting to a point where you are raising, capital, then yes, you need a pitch deck. But what's standing in the way of you getting funding is usually not the pitch deck. Like, there is not much of a correlation prior to, maybe Series B between how pretty your pitch deck is and your likelihood to get funding. Everybody's going to criticize your shitty deck, but it's not going to stop them from making an investment in you. Like, they don't care about your graphic design skills. Like, that's not what it's about. And so, like, if you just use the pitch deck as a tool for explaining what it is that you do, and what it is that you do is super clear, then you're kind of there. And the things that are going to sink you are going to be not focusing on the things within the business that matter. Is there a customer out there? Like I talk about like the 7 or 8 T's, I think, of like investability. Like you need the eight T's, right? So one, is the TAM, right? You have to have a market that's large enough for this to be interesting. It has to be at the right time, right? So timing is important. So why now? Why not a year ago? Why not a year from now, right? Why is now the right time to do this? What's the wave or growth or whatever that we're writing? AI is getting big right now, that kind of thing, right? So team and timing, TAM and timing. I said it, so we'll go team. So why you, right? So we have why you, why now, why this market, right? So we have that. We have other obvious ones like traction, right? So like, are you making actual progress in the marketplace, right? These are all holes you can cover. This is work that matters. Your traction. Then you have your terms, right? So this is the amount that you're asking for, and then your valuation is pre-money, post-money, that kind of thing. Is it the right vehicle? Is it a priced round versus a safe? Like all that stuff matters. And so you have to have the right terms associated with that. So team, TAM, timing, traction, terms. Theory is another one that I like to include in there. That's TH, but it's still a T. But your theory is the business model. It's the go-to-market strategy. It's all the stuff that you have some evidence for that comes from those other boxes, but they are themselves like how we're going to get large. We're not large yet. How are we going to get large? So theory is an important one. Another one that comes to play a lot is what I refer to as tracking, because I needed a T, but it's tracking is the just basically like your innovation accounting. It's what you were mentioning before about like roadmaps and measuring and all that. Like, are you even measuring the right thing? So those are like the big parts that you have: theory, tracking, team, TAM, timing, traction, terms, and then that's 7. Last is technology. So this might be your IP. Is it defensible, or how else are you defensible? It's like, it's the feasibility part of this. Like, can we pull this off? And usually we call that technology because we deal with highly scalable startups. But yeah,
I love it.
those are the things that matter. Those 8 things.
Yeah, I love it. The 2 that stand out, obviously they're different from me hearing as well, as the theory and the tracking. And I think that those are actually really interesting as we tie to like, you're not in the business of building a pitch deck, you're in the business of building the startup, right? And the theory and tracking are the 2 that I think are that through point of changing that mindset in relation to your pitch deck. Because ultimately, all of those other elements are pretty standard in the template, but the theory and the tracking really basically is that evidence that tells why this theory should exist and why someone should invest in that theory overall. And so I think that those 2 are really interesting.
I think you hit it on the head. And like, to tie it all the way back to where we started, like that theory and the tracking, that's cycles.
There we are.
That's all it is. I'm telling you, it cycles all the way down, baby.
I love it. I love it.
Well, unfortunately, with that, we that is all the time that we have for today. But before we go, we got some frivolous thoughts to share, some frivolity, because it wouldn't be Zero to Traction without frivolity or without frivolous thoughts. There, Cameron, I got 2 frivolous thoughts, 3 frivolous thoughts, 4. Oh my gosh, in a row without messing them up. I am on fire today. That's a deep cut for the rest of you that we don't really follow my inability to say that sometimes. But Cameron, what do you got for us?
So I'm gonna continue to bring us back to theory of where certain things came from, and so the one that I'm going to bring to us today is the the process of cheersing and where that came from. So the original cheers came from a time where cyanide was actually used as a method to kill people. And so they would cheers as a way to demonstrate that we haven't poisoned each other's drink, because a proper cheer would have one drink spilling into the next. And so you knew that that person had not poisoned you. And so therefore, when you cheers, you should do a proper cheers that, spills your beer into the next one.
And never cheers a wine glass, by the way. That's the wine glasses shouldn't technically touch, because if you do it with enough force to exchange wine, first of all, that's probably not a good idea. But then second, the glasses are going to shatter everywhere.
Well, I think we've moved past that time.
Is this true, or are you bullshitting us today, Cameron?
I don't know. That's for you to figure out the evidence behind it.
Oh, groan. All right.
It should be fact or not, or fact or not is what is adding to our frivolous thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, there we got. It's gonna be a fun game that we're gonna end up playing here. Is when can Cameron just pull one over on the rest of us with his etymology? Well, for my frivolous thought, is frivolous, but also not in the realm of fact or fiction, and that is a minor disappointment. So my wife and I just finished watching the mini series that they did after Justified, the TV show, went off the air. They had Justified City Primeval. Did you ever watch any of those, Cameron?
I watched early Justified, but I didn't watch future seasons. I liked it, but I think they stopped showing it, or I had to buy the next actual season of discs before. So
yeah, and it's on. It was on the streaming services, moving around. Who knows where it is now? But it was an FX show originally, critically acclaimed. I was surprised it was lasted as long as it did, because it was pretty good. But it's not for everybody, because it's not like a standard cop procedural. But it's Elmore Leonard, and it's all this good stuff. But anyway, so it had been off the air for a while, like 7-8 years, something like that. And they decided to do this mini series, bringing back the main character, played by Timothy Oliphant, who's a U.S. Marshal. Anyway, so they decided to do this miniseries from it, and it rated well, it's 91% or something on Rotten Tomatoes. And so my wife and I watched it, and it wasn't disappointing. That's not what I'm disappointed about. It was great to see the character back. That was cool. It was a good 8 episodes. That was all fun and awesome. The story itself, okay, it was fine. It wasn't bad, but it was fine. But it made me want more of the original. And this is what sucks. They have this, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it yet and you're going to maybe end the show now. But right at the end, they bring back, literally for the last 2 minutes of the final episode, they bring back a character who was a main character for the series run of the original, who got locked up in literally the last episode of the last season of the original show. He breaks out of jail, and they leave you with a cliffhanger, which is fine. That was cool. But they're not bringing the show back. As of right now, it was a year ago. They're not bringing the show back. They might, but they were never intended to. It was always an 8 episode run. So you bring an awesome character, mediocre show, and then a reference to when the show was good, and you're like, now I want more of the original, and that's expressly what you're telling me you're not going to give me. Screw everyone, all y'all. And also, thank you for making it. It was fun to watch. But yeah, I'm just in a ranting mood today. Apparently, that's all I got.
I love it.
Well, I mean, that's all for this episode. We will kill it here. We're actually a little overtime, which is okay. But thanks so much for listening. Be sure to subscribe, follow, and Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever, YouTube, whatever you're listening to this right now. You can subscribe to the show for free on Substack. That'd be cool, and then you get the email notifications with the show notes when the show comes out and all that. That's a nice, easy way to stay in the loop. Again, totally free. It's not a paid Substack; it's a free Substack. And if you found this interesting, helpful, insightful, this might be too much to hope for, not boring, we'll take that. If you found it anything this side of positive, leave us a review. We'd really appreciate it. It helps the show grow, gets us in the hands of more founders, and we have to appease the algorithm. So I'm sorry for asking, but yeah, we're slaves. And a review, it helps out. So we'll be back. We'll be back soon. But that's it for this episode of Zero to Traction. Cameron, thanks so much for hanging out with me today.
Thank you. Thank you for another great conversation.
Yeah, it was awesome, and I'll see you then. All right.